much for being here tonight. We are more than excited than you know to do this. After 2 years of doing it virtually, we are just so happy to have you here and really appreciate the time that you've taken as a family to be here to join us tonight. My name is Stephanie Smith. I am the Director of School Counseling here at Berners Township, and it is my privilege every day to work alongside the best high school counseling department that exists. These are very dedicated, very caring, hardworking, and just amazing professionals. It's a very seasoned team, and we also welcome some new faces with us here tonight that we're happy to have you meet as well. We have Dr. Lazovic in the back, who we appreciate his support for everything that we do, and Mr. Berry, too, for supporting us this evening. Just a few housekeeping items for tonight. We are recording this, and so if there's anything that you want to look back on to review as a family, we will be posting this video within the next week or so to our website. And I also ask that you just silence your cell phones at this time. We will also post the actual PowerPoint slides, so that way any of the hyperlinks that you see tonight, you'll be able to click on those once we get the presentation up online. The first part of our presentation is a PowerPoint slide, and then the second half is a Q&A session. And so just one note about that Q&A session, we just ask that you ask questions that will benefit the group here. We have some MCs and some panelists who will be taking your questions. If there's anything really individual that applies to your child and your specific family circumstance, we are happy to help you. I would just redirect you to your school counselor individually, one-on-one, so that way we can take the most questions that benefit the most of us here as a group. And with no further ado, I will pass it over to Mr. Bienkowski to get us started.
Good evening, everyone. So the goals for the meeting: help parents feel more confident with exactly what their child needs to do in the entire application process. So with what your child's doing, you can follow along with them too and see it from both sides. Discuss with other post-secondary plans. We're here to help with all post-secondary pathways, whether it's four-year college, two-year college, military, trade school, workforce. We're here to help with all paths. Explain how students work with their counselor during this time. Introduce our post-secondary planning site, and present our 10 steps to complete the application process, which will be presented tonight, which all the seniors have as well. Our role as counselors: support and guidance during and throughout the process, answer questions, meet with students one-on-one, and help them navigate the post-secondary planning site, which is here. Just some few tabs: applications, coalition, essay writing, gap year, letters, NCAA, and other post-secondary options too. Before the steps, there are different types of admissions. There's regular decision, early action, single choice early action, priority, rolling admissions, open admissions. 3 types of applications are common applications. We encourage all the seniors to use common application if the school takes the common app, because Naviance links directly to that site. Naviance acts as our liaison between us and the colleges. We can send the transcripts, letters, and any paperwork that the colleges need through Naviance. Coalition application, an application option used by colleges in addition to other options such as the Common App, and university-specific applications. If a school doesn't take Common App, each student has to apply to the university or college application that's specific to that school. And they can choose which application to submit and discuss questions with their counselor. So there's college visits that are at Ridge. Any college visits will occur in the media center during the school day. Students need to sign up at least one day before the event. They all have a video on how to sign up for those visits. And visits will be in person or remote depending on the college's preference. And virtual visits will be accessed on the student's Chromebook in the media center. And now Ms. Hughes for step 1.
Hi, everyone. So as was mentioned earlier, we have created sort of a 10-step process, which helps students kind of figure out the different steps in a more easy and condensed way. So I'm going to talk about the first couple of steps with you guys. And the first one is completing the senior packet. So there are two parts to the senior packet Part A and Part B. And Part A would have been due back in June. So your student should have handed it in then. But if they haven't, they still have time to get it to us. That is able to be submitted through Google Classroom, and it was posted as an assignment back in June. Senior packet Part A has questions in regards to your child's activities, some questions about themselves, and then also some part for you to fill out where you can speak about your student to us as well. And then senior packet Part B, which is our next step, is going to be due next week on September 20th. So just keep an eye out for that deadline. And senior packet Part B is also posted in the Google Classroom. Senior packet Part B is really a communication tool between the student and us. The most important piece of that is that they are going to be submitting us a general list of what schools they're applying to and what the deadlines are. And so this list will help us figure out when we need to meet with them and get things going based on what their earliest deadline is. Additionally, senior packet Part B has a sheet for them to sign, which is a waiver that they need to sign, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And they'll also submit us a resume with anything updated that's happened over the summer, if they had any new work experiences or things that they wanted to share with us. These two packets together help us write the best letter of recommendation that we possibly can on behalf of the student. So all the information provided there is really helpful to us. And if your student has any questions about submission or what these packets are used for, we do encourage them to let us know. So step 2 is paying the transcript fee. This is one of the earlier things that students can do in the process, even if they haven't started the actual application itself. And this transcript fee is a one-time $7 fee that's paid through the high school website. It's paid by card, and the $7 fee covers all schools and all types of transcripts that will be sent, such as the original transcript, the mid-year transcript, and the final transcript. So it's not $7 per school or per transcript, it's just $7 the one time. Like Ms. Smith mentioned earlier, we will be posting these slides later on, and there's a link in here on how exactly to pay this fee, where to find it, all of that stuff. And each of these slides actually has a linked video on how to do this step that the students can watch. Okay. So the next step, which is super important, is updating Naviance. Your student should be able to log into Naviance through the student account, and if they are having any trouble at all logging into Naviance, they are welcome to email us. We can help them with resetting the password or getting into their account. And once they're in there, there should be a list called Colleges I'm Thinking About, which students probably set up about last spring when we had our junior conferences with them. And so it's really important that they go into that list and move over any schools that they are planning to apply to colleges from colleges I'm thinking about to colleges I'm applying to. Now, this allows their counselors and teachers to see what colleges that they are officially applying to and what their deadlines are, so it's really important for them to do this step. And this step will also allow students to request transcripts on behalf of a school. So if it's left in that colleges I'm thinking about section, they won't be able to request a transcript, but once they move it over, they will be able to. Step 4, which is a super easy one, is making a Common Application account. Most schools these days are taking the Common App, although there are still a couple of other applications out there that colleges take, such as a coalition app, or some schools have their own personal application. But for the most part, the Common App is the most popular platform of application. Students will go onto the website and create an account, and they can enter information in the first couple of pages super easily. So this is going to ask family and personal information and information about Ridge, which we have the answers for on our post-secondary website that we touched on earlier. So some of the questions you might run into are how many students are in the graduating class, how many honors at AP classes do we offer and things like that. And those can all be found on the post-secondary website, which you guys will have access to and students have access to as well. The other great thing about the Common App is they can start it at any time and come back and finish it another time. So if you open it up, it saves where you have typed up to, and you don't have to do it all in one shot. It's sometimes easier for students to do that demographic section and then come back later on and visit it a couple of times to get it done. Okay. Step 5 is completing the FERPA waiver, which is in the Common Application. So the FERPA waiver covers a law that governs access to educational information and records. So basically what the waiver is asking is, do students waive their right to read the letters of recommendation that others have written on behalf of them or not? So most of the time, colleges would prefer if a student does waive that right because they would like it to indicate that recommenders are writing a non-biased letter and one that they're not concerned about the student seeing later on. However, if a student feels strongly about saying that they don't want to waive that right, they're able to do that as well. In order to do this, the student must log into their Common App account and follow the directions. There's a video tutorial linked here that allows them to fill out this FERPA waiver. Like I said earlier, students should consider waiving their right because it does reassure colleges that these letters are non-biased. And sometimes, in some cases, colleges might not consider the letters that were written if they know that the student has had access to them. One important note is that once students make a decision on this matter, they actually can't go back and change it. So you want to talk about it as a family and think about it a lot before the student makes the decision. And the second part of step 5, which you can do after that FERPA waiver, would be matching Naviance and the Common App. And in order to match Naviance and the Common App, you'll follow the tutorial in this slide. It's super easy, but any student who's using the Common App for at least one school will need to connect their accounts together. And this step is necessary so that we can be notified and see where students are at in the Common App and make sure that we're sending the supporting documents appropriately, like the counselor letter of rec or the transcript. They can only do this after they've created the Common App account and after they've added at least one school to their Common App, and once they complete the FERPA waiver, which is why it's part 2 of step 5. They'll do this in Naviance. They'll go into the account and there should be a button that will allow them to match their accounts. And sometimes students do run into issues with this if they've used a separate email from their Naviance account to create their Common App account. So if they can use the same email, that usually works best. Please note that we absolutely cannot send a student's transcript until this part happens. So it does need to be done in order for that transcript request process to move forward. And also teachers won't be able to send their letters of rec until this part happens. So it's a really important step. I am going to pass the mic to Ms. Coviello to talk about the next 5 steps.
Hello, everyone. So step 6 is teacher letters of recommendation. So if your child has not already asked teacher or multiple teachers, this must be done as soon as possible. This is because the teacher needs ample amount of time to write the letter, and depending on your child's deadline, just to make sure that enough time is given. So how to do this? Your child should log into the student Naviance account, and they need to follow the directions to add a letter of recommendation requests. And again, this is a video linked tutorial to help you walk through that process. Your child should also decide if they want their teacher to send to all of their colleges or just specific schools. So check the number of letter of recommendations the schools will accept, such as another university might just accept 1, some will accept 2, so keep that in mind when requesting a certain teacher to a specific school if you want that teacher to send it to that school. Also, please note, your child should not request a teacher recommendation via the Common App. We use Naviance to send the letters, so that must be done through the Naviance, not the Common App. And teachers send letters directly to the colleges, and a copy will not be provided to your child. And lastly, like I said before, your child should give teachers enough time to send their letter and provide any additional materials that they may have requested, such as questions you need answered. Step 7, the Google form. What is this? Your child will use this form to communicate they are ready for their senior meeting with us counselors, because they have turned in their senior packets, Part A and B, and completed steps 1 through 6 that we just discussed. And keep in mind, students, for not using the Common App, they only need to complete steps 1, 2, 3, and 6, because 4 and 5 relate to the Common App. Why does your child need to do this? So this is for your counselor to schedule, their counselor to schedule a meeting with them, and we can do that after they submit that form. This lets us know that they're ready for their meeting. And students should be patient once they have submitted this form. This is because we meet with all students before their first reported deadline. So students who have a specific early deadline, such as October 1st or 15th, we want to make sure we meet with them first before their deadline to make sure they're all ready. Okay. And also, if your child changes their first deadline after submitting Part B of the packet, they need to communicate that with us counselors and their specific counselor. And how to submit this? This is posted in the counselor's Google Classroom, and that will be found in the classwork section. So once they complete that on Google Classroom, they're ready for their meeting. Step 8, what to do with test scores. So the RHS transcript does not include the standardized test scores such as the SAT and the ACT. These scores are sent directly from the College Board SAT website or the ACT website. And this is your responsibility, your child's responsibility, to send these scores. We do not send these scores to the university. So they should log into their online account, whether College Board or ACT, to complete this step. There is a fee to send the scores to each school. So keep in mind, for SAT, it's a $12 per school fee, and the ACT is $13 per school. Standardized testing continued. You might have heard that some schools are test optional, which means students can choose whether or not to submit their SAT or ACT scores. So please check before sending them. Some schools are self-reporting standardized test scores, so they will allow the students to add their scores as part of their application. So check to see if any of your child's schools have this policy before sending. And if they are done testing, please send the scores now. This is because we need ample time for schools to be delivered. So best practice is having 4 to 5 weeks prior to their first deadline. So it takes time for them to be sent. So if they're done, send them off. Also, rush reporting SAT and priority ports ACT. We do not recommend sending these scores, as many schools do not accept rushed or priority reports. And if your child is taking any additional tests, each time they register for an SAT or ACT, they may choose up to 4 schools to send the scores for free. So that saves money. And AP scores. Generally, this is not a part of the application process, and usually this is sent after your child enrolls in the university. Step 9, requesting transcripts. So they are made in the student Naviance account only. Transcripts may not be requested until your child has submitted the senior packet Part A and B and paid the fee for the transcript. Also, it's important to note is self-reported academic records. Those are SRARs. This is where some colleges do not require transcripts, but instead ask students to manually enter their courses and the grades they've taken all throughout their 4 years at Ridge and into an SRAR. So you need to determine if each school requires a transcript or is a self-reported SRAR school. You need to request a transcript for each school that requires one, and for those that do not, you need to complete the process of an SRAR. For example, some schools that request an SRAR are Rutgers, University of Pittsburgh, Penn State, University of Delaware, are schools that use that. And for schools that require a transcript, we also have a video tutorial attached for the step-by-step process. Step 10, completing the applications. So students should complete the applications by their chosen deadline. Payment will be made online when the application is submitted, whether that's through the Common App or their own university's website. And if you have any questions with Common App issues, we recommend reaching out to their help center as well. Essays, which are also a part of the application, we have linked some Common App essay prompts for 2022-2023. And it's important to note that the Common App is one application where they're applying with multiple schools. So make sure their essay doesn't have a specific school in their essay. So when they apply, it will say, like, don't say University of Pittsburgh, I really want to go here, but then it goes to all of the schools. Also, supplemental essays may be required for some colleges, and your child may plan enough time for writing. So that's found in the Common App as well. It's in a specific tab of the school. You can find any additional questions that the school may have and supplemental essays. And early decision agreements. If your child is applying early decision ED, they must complete the ED agreement. And again, early decision is if you know this is your top #1 school, and no matter what, it's like a legally binding document, contract. So if you get accepted, you have to go to this school, and you withdraw all your other applications and acceptances. And if directions for doing so are provided in the post-secondary planning site. And also Common App schools versus non-Common App schools for ED agreements. So for Common App schools, they must sign electronically through the Common App, and they will be prompted to sign when they select ED as their preferred admission plan. And they also must select ED as the application deadline in Naviance as well. Otherwise, that ED agreement is not available for the counselor to electronically sign. And if your child decides to apply ED after the transcript is sent, they must notify us, their counselor, because we do not receive a notice to go back and sign that agreement. And for non-Common App schools, just follow the website and how, to follow the directions for signing that agreement. And if they're not applying through the Common App, for a counselor signature with the ED agreement, either you can scan it or take a picture of the document after you sign the document and your child signs it, and then you can email it to us, the counselors. Then we'll email it back to you, and then you can send it to the college. And now I'm going to pass the presentation over to Ms. Cucurell. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk about some important topics outside the 10 steps now that we've finished them. But before I do that, I just kind of want to reflect back on what we've just heard with the 10 steps. As a department, we've spent a very long time, years in fact, just trying to simplify this process as much as possible, and knowing that there's so much out there. We've heard from families and students for years, like, we're just not sure where to start. Are we missing anything? So we made this 10-step process with that in mind, to give you a guideline and keep everyone on the same page, and also ensure that you don't miss any steps, and we hope that you find it helpful and follow along with it as such. Okay, so you've done the 10 steps, and now what? What's next? Your students should be checking the portals to see if materials were received. Each school has a portal that you can log in, personal to that school, to make sure that materials that were sent were received by that particular college. We want to point out and just kind of remind you that if your student receives a notification from a college saying, we're missing the transcript, or we're missing the letter, or we're missing a piece that has been submitted, our advice is to call the school and just check to make sure that it's not something that they have already received. A lot of times what happens is, as you can imagine, they're getting thousands and thousands of materials with students all across the world, and it takes time for them to input that information into their system. So what happens a lot is that they will send out a batch email to students, and it causes a great deal of panic, of course, thinking, I thought the counselor submitted my transcript, or I know I hit send on the application. So we always recommend to call and just check and make sure, and 9.9 times out of 10, they're gonna say, oh yes, we've received that, we just haven't updated it in the portal. So if that does happen to you, just simply make a phone call, and if there is anything wrong besides that, we are here to help with that as well. Okay, first marking period grades. The first marking period will end, and colleges are definitely interested in seeing how your student has done in the first marking period. These are sent automatically to the school, so it is actually like an opt-out program instead of an opt-in. So if your student does not want the scores sent to the colleges for whatever reason, they can fill out our request to withhold marking period 1 grades form, in which case we would hold back those grades. Now, an exception to that rule would be that if a college contacts us and says, please send the grades for so-and-so, we do have to send them in that case, even though they've requested them not to be sent. So if the college is asking for them, we do send them. Okay, mid-year reports. It's midway through the year, and the college is still interested in how your student's doing. The mid-year report is an average of the first and second marking period grade averaged together. It is the classes they're in. It is 1 grade per class. It is an updated GPA that includes freshman, sophomore, junior, and now half of senior year. So they do see that as well. They will be asking for that. And the good news is there's nothing your student needs to do. We send that automatically as well, as soon as it is ready, to the colleges to which your student has applied. Okay, final reminders. As adults, we know about social media etiquette, or hopefully we do, but it's a good reminder for students, and we reminded them when we met with them. It is important to be mindful about what they're posting online, that they're using an email address that is appropriate, that they're checking that email address. We've heard from reps a lot where they say, well, we emailed the student and we never heard back, and the kid will say, well, I don't check that email. It's like, okay, well, you need to check that email. So just remind them whatever email they're listing in the application that they should be checking that. Obviously, Facebook, Twitter, all the platforms have been around for some time now, but what we've seen an increase in is them checking the student accepted sites. So if your student is accepted to a school and wants to join whatever site they have, they are monitoring that for appropriateness or not appropriateness. So we've heard some horror stories there as well. So you want to make sure whatever they're posting on those sites as well is something that is appropriate. Financial aid information. So there are 2 different financial aid pieces that I want to talk about tonight, the FAFSA and the CSS profile. So the most important thing here is making sure you are using these or completing them by the college's deadline. Obviously, following deadlines is very important. The FAFSA is number 1. The FAFSA stands for Free Application for Federal Student Aid. Okay, you'll be doing that online. The key is free. If they are charging you a fee, you are not on the right website. Okay, it's free, and that's the one that you're doing. It should not cost you anything to do. This is used to determine a student's eligibility for financial aid. These include federal grants, work study, and various types of loans. Some colleges also want students filling out the FAFSA if they are to award them any scholarships as well. The form is going to require financial information from students and parents, and it applies a formula to determine your expected family contribution, otherwise known as EFC. The EFC is the amount of money the government thinks that your family could reasonably pay for 1 academic year of college while taking into consideration a family's income and asset net worth. Our general recommendation is that all families fill out the FAFSA. It does become available on October 1st, which is just a few short weeks away. In addition to the FAFSA, some schools will require what's called a CSS profile. This is used by certain colleges, typically the smaller private colleges. The financial information collected on there is slightly different than what you would enter on the FAFSA. It takes into account things like medical expenses, elementary school tuition, and other household expenses. It allows schools who utilize it to consider this information when coming up with a financial aid package for a student. There is a nominal fee for the CSS profile, and there's a link on the College Board website that will give you all the schools that utilize that CSS profile, as well as a direct link to that form. So you're just checking what schools your student is applying to and are they looking for that CSS profile. The last thing on here is the counseling events calendar. That is a link that we have with all of our events that are coming up. 2 things I want to point out at this point that are coming up is October the 12th is the financial aid night. We're going to have someone come and speak more in depth than the information that I just gave you, which was a very general overview. And we also have the college fair on October 13th, and that is a time to come and meet with reps and get more information. So those are 2 nights back to back that we welcome families to attend, and that both can be found on the counseling events calendar. Okay, we've come to the end of the presentation, and we want to take a moment to highlight the important and influential part you play as parents during this college application season. In our role as counselors, we want to remind you that your child is likely experiencing a lot of feelings about applying to college and what their lives after high school might look like. What we find year after year is that this time is always filled with a great deal of mixed emotions. In our offices, we see everything from pure excitement and joy to uncertainty and feeling scared. Applying to college and all that follows is by nature a lot of unknowns for students. What we know about unknowns is that they are unpredictable. While that can be fun, new, and exciting, it can be really scary too. We want you to recall a time as an adult that you faced some unknowns of your own and remember how you felt. We want you to think about who was helpful to you at that time and what they did that was meaningful to you. What you may be recalling as you think of your scenario is someone who supported you in some way, whether it was to listen to your fears or join in your enthusiasm of new possibilities ahead. And that's who you can be now for your child. You are the person who knows your child best and is best suited for the role of encourager, listener, or whatever else they might need. As parents, you have a beautiful opportunity right now to be your child's biggest cheerleader and supporter through their own unknowns, and even more importantly, a safe space to land no matter what the outcome of this process brings. You can be the person with whom, years later, they remember sharing this exciting time. The passage I'm about to read is written by a father to his son who communicates a very simple message. I am proud of you, no matter what. We encourage you to echo his sentiments in your own special way to your own child during this time, and hope that this passage helps shape your perspective as you navigate the important role you play on this journey to the next chapter of your child's life. It starts, Dear Matt, on the night before you receive your first college response, I'm going to try not to get emotional. There's bets in the counseling department if I'm going to cry, and it's probably yes. We wanted to let you know that we could not be any prouder of you than we are today. Whether or not you get accepted does not determine how proud we are of everything you have accomplished and the wonderful person you have become. That will not change based on what admissions officers decide about your future. We will celebrate with joy wherever you get accepted, and the happier you are with these responses, the happier we will be. But your worth as a person, a student, and our son is not diminished or influenced in the least by what these colleges have decided. If it does not go your way, you'll take a different route to get to where you want. There is not a single college in this country that would not be lucky to have you, and you are capable of succeeding at any of them. We love you as deep as the ocean, as high as the sky, all around the world and back again, and to wherever you are headed, Mom and Dad. I made it. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to Mrs. Trainer at this point.
Is this on? Oh, good. Okay, so now that concludes part one of tonight's presentation. And I want to thank my colleagues for presenting all of that important and valuable information. So here we're going to start part two of the presentation, which is our live Q&A section. We did send out communication asking for some emailed questions, so we are going to go through them, but then we are going to open it up to the floor to in-person questions, so feel free to raise your hand. I do want to kind of remind you to go back to what Ms. Smith said in the beginning of the presentation. We're going to ask you to please refrain from asking any personal questions during the Q&A. Certainly after tonight's presentation, if you have a specific question, please reach out to your school counselor. We want to help you, so just save those questions for at a later time. I am joined tonight by Ms. McGivney, who's on the opposite side, as my co-moderator for the Q&A. We're going to help answer some questions, and also I'm joined by my other amazing colleagues, Ms. Cahill and Ms. Wu. So we will begin with our first question, which is an email question regarding different application types. Hang on one second. Okay. This is a really good question, so I'm really happy that someone sent it in. We get this question often in our office. So the question is talking about the intricacies of early action, early decision versus regular. Sometimes the deadline is the same. What is the disadvantage or advantage of early action? Are there any advantages to regular admissions timeline? Ms. Cahill, do you want to start with that one?
Okay, so this is sometimes specific to the particular schools to which your student is applying and also their particular profile. So basically what this question is asking is, should I be encouraging my student to apply during early action? Is there some advantage to applying early action? Or is there some advantage maybe in some cases to waiting until regular decision? So the one deadline that we know gives some advantage is an early decision, because early decision is a binding agreement, right? You are agreeing that if accepted, you will attend. So basically for colleges, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? They know that that student is going to come to their school. So if there's going to be an advantage, it's truly going to be during the early decision process or the early decision 2 process. So that we know to be true. However, early decision is binding, and some of your students may either be looking at schools that don't have an early decision process, or they may not be ready to make that commitment by early decision 1, or maybe even by early decision 2, which is typically in January. So early decision 1 is usually November 1st or November 15th. Some of them can be in December, but typically they're in November. Early action has a very similar deadline to early decision, but the difference between early action and early decision is that early action is not a binding application. So you're applying earlier in November, for example, maybe the 1st, maybe the 15th, sometimes December 1st, and you're generally receiving an answer sometime prior to the holiday break, or if not, usually sometime in the month of January. So prior to those typical March release dates that you would see from a regular decision application. So why might a student want to apply early action? There are some schools that actually take 80 to 90% of their applicant pool during their early action deadline. So it's actually really important to know for a particular school how inclined they are to accept students from that particular deadline versus how inclined they are to balance that out between their early action pool and their regular decision pool. Some schools right on their website will say to you, there is absolutely no advantage to applying early action other than the fact that your student will receive an answer earlier than they would if they applied regular decision. But there are some schools that are very upfront about the idea that it does provide them with a little bit of an advantage. They think of it as, you must be really interested in us if you're applying in an early action deadline. So it really does depend on the school. It also depends on your student's profile. Why might you wait till regular decision? Well, maybe you have something to prove your senior year. Maybe junior year didn't go as well for you as a prior year, and maybe you had a dip during your junior year, and you want to show that that's not who you are as a student, and you want to show them the first semester worth of grades and GPA from your senior year, in which case you would need to wait till regular decision to do that. So the bottom line is, this is a discussion that you should really have with your child's counselor, and really that your child should have with your child's counselor.
Thank you, Ms. Cahill. Ms. Wu, I'll pass the next question to you. We heard a lot of information this evening, and you're probably thinking, when I leave here, what is the next step? So, Ms. Wu, can you answer this question? Where is the start to filling out college applications, and what should be the target timeline to complete those applications?
All right, so I think the first step in terms of knowing what to do from leaving here is, if you guys have an idea of what your child's list of colleges is at this point, which, some of you may have a solid foundation and know what 5, 7, 10 schools you're child is applying to, and whereas some of you may still be working on that list, and that's fine. But the first step would really be to look at each school's individual websites to look at their step-by-step directions in terms of how to apply. You want to know what type of application they have. As we mentioned before, there are some schools that utilize Common App only, so you would be using that to apply to multiple schools. There are some schools that will use both Common App and Coalition. There are some schools who have their own application on their website. So that would be, the first thing to know is what application will you be using to apply to those schools, and then also figuring out, what deadline are you applying to those schools by, so that you have an idea of, what your timeline is to figure out what steps you need to take. And if your son or daughter have any questions in terms of, should I be applying early, like we just mentioned, or later, that's something that they can definitely talk to their individual counselors about.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ms. Wu. Okay, so now we're going to open up to live questions in person. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask the panel? Go ahead, you can raise your hand. Okay, great.
I think some colleges now probably accept one letter of recommendation or maximum two, but in case they accept only one letter of recommendation, is it advisable to share the counselor letter of recommendation or the teacher one?
That's a really good question. So there are actually some schools that specify that they only take the counselor letter of recommendation, which makes it easy because you know which one you're sending. The counselor letter is the one that accompanies the transcript as well. So some schools will use the language, we will read the letter of recommendation that accompanies the transcript, so then you know they're only taking the counselor letter. However, typically when they say they'll read one teacher letter, what they mean is one teacher letter. And so they'll still read the counselor letter because it comes along with the transcript, and then they will also read, in addition to that, one teacher letter. If there is some question as to whether a counselor letter includes like the letter of recommendation, I would say that that student can contact that particular school for clarification. Are you only reading one letter of recommendation total, or are you reading one teacher letter plus the documents that accompany my transcript, which might include then my counselor letter?
Do we have another in-person question? Okay, Ms. McGivney is coming your way.
Yeah, still for the letters, like you already say if you have 3 letters, right? Do students need to remind the teachers for the deadline for each college, For example, if we have 20 colleges,
Yeah, so just to follow up, in terms of the letter of recommendation process, so we did go over this with your students during our meeting, and we also, have a little bit of information on our PowerPoint that we shared with students. But students should have, of course, communicated with their teachers prior to this year. Usually the discussions about letters of recommendation start in the spring of their junior year. That's when they ask a teacher, will you be willing to write for me during my senior year? Once they've solidified that, yes, in fact, that teacher is willing to write for them, sometimes the teachers ask them for supplemental materials of some sort. Maybe give me some feedback about what you thought about my class, maybe some feedback about why it is that you've asked me for that letter. For example, that student may want to study something in that particular area. So sometimes that was due by the end of last school year. In terms of what communication they should have with teachers this year, they request the teacher on Naviance. When they request the teacher on Naviance, assuming that the student has followed the steps we've outlined, their Naviance list should be updated. It should indicate all of the schools to which they're applying and what deadlines they're using, so the teachers can see when their first deadline is. So they get notified that the student has requested their letter of recommendation. I would say it's always good practice to connect. Just wanted to make sure you saw my request. Thank you again so much for being willing to write my letter of recommendation. Please let me know if you have any questions or need anything from me in the process. But if the student has followed those original steps that we outlined, the teacher should have no problem uploading and sending to those schools. If they have an issue, they generally reach out to your student.
Okay, great. I think we have a question up here, headed this way.
I'm just going to add something with that too. Just with Naviance, the students can actually check in Naviance to see the status of the recommendation request. So they'll actually be able to see, like, has the teacher acknowledged, I guess, the application, so it should shift over to in progress. And then when a teacher has submitted the letter, it'll indicate that it's been submitted to the school. So they can check on Naviance to see if the letter of recommendation has been sent.
For schools where the, oh, sorry.
Sorry. The other thing that I wanted to mention is just like the counselor letters, teachers are often working on quite a few letters of recommendation, so students should expect that teachers may have to work to that deadline. So in other words, November 1st is a big deadline for students. I'm sure you're already starting to hear the murmurings in your own household of like, I have November 1st deadlines. Most kids do. So what I would say is teachers and counselors are working up to that deadline, which means that something might not be submitted and it's a few days away from the deadline, which tends to send students into like a new stratosphere of panic. So it's okay to reach out and just say, I just want to clarify everything's good, like you're not having any issues uploading, things are great, but keep in mind that we're all working to that same deadline. So one student may, for example, have their couple of applications that are due. Counselors, for example, may have 50 kids that are all applying by November 1st. Teachers could have that many as well. So they get there. It's just that sometimes they get there 2 or 3 days before, the day of, because we truly do work up to those deadlines because we have that many students who are all using the same one. Sorry, go ahead.
For schools where the ACT, SAT score submissions are optional, we just visited one and he said if they're exceptional, go ahead and submit them, and if they're not, then don't. But what if they're middle of the road? What would you recommend? Is that an extra data point, or just leave it off, or does it depend?
Yeah, I mean, listen, what I would say about that is sometimes student specific. It is sometimes school specific. I would probably have that student touch base with their counselor about those decisions. Typically, I would err on the side of saying if it doesn't help you, I honestly would save yourself the money of sending it, because if it's not going to help you, there's sort of no point in sending that information. What I've told some of my students is, right now, or at least as of last year, many schools were reporting that 60% of their applicant pool was not submitting scores. So I guess when I think about it that way, I think about the idea that if you're comparing two candidates and one of them has scores and the other one doesn't, and you have vowed not to penalize the one that hasn't, you're going to have to look to something else to compare them. So if your score is middle of the road and now you've provided it, now there is extra data, but it doesn't necessarily help you at this point. So I almost feel like the more information you provide when it's not helpful is like only going to serve to potentially be another point of comparison. Now maybe they go with another person who has that score and they're comparing you instead of GPA to GPA. When a student has higher scores than GPA, then maybe there's a reason to send a middle of the road score to that particular school because the student's GPA actually falls below, right? So there could be reasons why strategy-wise you would submit a middle of the road score, but for the most part, I would probably err on the side of not.
And just to kind of add to that also, oftentimes we're meeting with students and what you decide to do for one school, you might decide to be test optional for this school, but you're sending for this school. So it really does depend on the student and the school. Okay, you had a question too, okay.
So when is the first marking period over, and then how quick do the transcripts get sent out?
I can tell you marking period 1 ends November 11th, because I memorize calendars. And the transcripts go out, teachers have, the marking period ends, teachers have to verify grades, submit grades. So we're talking sometime mid to end of November is when they're sent out. Okay, sure. Next question. Anybody on that side over there, question? Okay, Ms. McGivney will come over here.
What is the general decision usual deadline? So not the early, the general decision.
So for regular decision, for the most part, it will be sometime in January. There are some schools that may have a regular decision deadline date later in February, but typically it'll be January, February.
Do you mean the notification deadline or the decision deadlines? Okay.
Okay. I saw some hands over here somewhere. Okay, I'm making my way over here. Okay, good question. I'll take this question. The question was, if you're not early action or early decision, do you have till regular decision to apply? Okay, that also depends on the school, because some schools may have a deadline that's called rolling. So that means the sooner you apply, The sooner the application is complete, the sooner you get a decision. So you might see a rolling deadline of, let's say, April 1st. You really don't want to wait till April 1st. So you want to get it in as soon as your application is ready. So it varies from school. You could be early action, early decision, regular decision, rolling. They're on a continuing basis. So some schools will start getting them out when they have a completed application within maybe 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the school. Okay. Ms. McGivney's up there with a question.
How do the colleges take into consideration the profile of the school that the applicant is from?
So that's a great question. So just for those of you who don't know what that means, the profile of a school is something that we send a link for along with the transcript and the secondary school report. So the profile shows schools what classes we offer. It shows schools what percentile a student falls in approximately based on their GPA. Ridge High School doesn't rank, so instead of showing you a class rank, it shows you approximate percentile for the students who are graduating, not only in this year's class of 2023, but in the previous couple years as well, just so that they can make a comparison. It also shows you which colleges the previous school year's students had committed to last year or were accepted to and attended the previous year. What else is in there? Like median SAT and ACT scores. So there's quite a bit of information. It also will give you like a little bit of a blurb about the community itself and the educators that teach within that community, just to kind of give you an idea of how to compare from one high school to another. So that's a great question. How do they decide how to use that profile information? So what I would say is a lot of the colleges to which our students apply, they probably know that profile without even looking at this year's. Like they're gonna get a little bit more information from this year's profile in terms of like exact stats, but they kind of know what Ridge High School is, because typically the people who read for a particular area numerous years in a row. So the way that admissions offices work is that they typically assign field reps to a particular area. So they may read for Central New Jersey, for example. Or if you're talking about a school that is further away and gets less New Jersey applicants, maybe all of New Jersey. But the bottom line is that rep is sort of charged with understanding the schools that they are reading applications from. So a lot of the schools that are used to kind of seeing our applicants are kind of used to who and what we are. So they will use that profile, though, to compare a student from Ridge to a student who might be from another district. It wouldn't be fair to compare a student from a school that offers no AP classes, for example, to a student from here who took maybe 6 AP classes in 1 year. That student can't do that. So they have to know whether they maximize their curriculum or what types of courses they signed up for compared to what was offered. So they use that data in order to compare students across high schools to get an idea of what type of high school it is, what type of courses they offer, and therefore how that applicant compares to their peers from their particular high school. So what does that mean for a student coming from Ridge High School? So that basically means we're a competitive high school. So a student who has a particular GPA here, it might be really hard to get that GPA here, whereas in another school, it might not be as hard to get that GPA. So we hear a lot of rumors, a lot of murmurings about like, oh, they add like 2 points to the GPA. That's like how they figure out like how to, no, they totally don't do anything like that. I have no idea what they're talking about or where that came from. But really what they do is just try to get an understanding of how competitive the school is and how your student compares to potentially the rest of their peers based on the school profile, and they utilize other school profiles to compare those students as well.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and answer a question that we got and that was submitted through the email. So the question is, if you receive a positive answer with an early application, how quickly do you need to decide whether or not to go to that school? So we've been talking a lot about different deadlines, so we want to think a little bit further down the line when your student is actually going to go ahead and make a decision. So the college signing day, the official day, is May 1st. They can make a decision at any time after they've heard back from their individual schools. If they do decide to go and sign with a specific school and pay the deposit, your student can go ahead and then withdraw their other applications. This process looks a little bit different, of course, for each school, because each school has a different process. So if your student is having a hard time, and we're talking about in a couple months from now, figuring out how to withdraw their application, they can go ahead and reach out to their school counselor, and we can help with that.
All right, I know there's a hand up here.
In your opinion, is it better to declare a major or not, particularly when the major they're declaring is quite difficult?
So I think that's a conversation, or a question rather, that we get a lot and we'll have conversations about. But I think that's something that students can certainly talk to their school counselors about, because it does depend, on the major and the school that they're looking at, because every school is different in terms of, what they're using that information for. Sometimes students may put a major that they're interested in, but it's not necessarily used for admissions purposes. Sometimes it is for schools in terms of determining what college or school within a university that they're going to. So, they may have to at least have an idea of what school they're applying to, if a school or university has like a college that you have to select, and then you can apply undecided within that college in that school. So it definitely depends on the university that you're applying to.
Yeah, I would also just add that, it is really school dependent and student dependent. So for example, there may be some schools for which a particular program is very competitive. And a student might say to us, well, then I'm not going to apply for that particular major within that particular college, within that particular university, right? Because larger universities have colleges within the university. And then a lot of times I will say, okay, I can understand why you might want to do that. Have you spoken to them about how difficult it is to transfer into that major later? And sometimes I'm met with like that, oh, that's a thing? Like it might be harder later? No, it might be near impossible later, so it actually might be easier to get in as a freshman than it actually is as an upperclassman student. So there might be reasons why declaring your major, if you are set on the idea that this is what you want to do and you wouldn't go to that school if you ultimately can't get into that program, then maybe you need to declare it ahead of time so that that way you have an answer as to whether you're ever going to get there. If a school is more liberal arts in nature and you can transfer from one major to another, then it may not matter. And I would never tell a student to strategically apply to a particular major thinking it's the easier one to get into. We've had a couple of experiences where students have picked some random major that they thought sounded like nobody would apply to it, and then found out later that it's actually like a niche program for that particular school, and they take like 10 candidates a year into the program. So it's not a good idea to do something like that either. I would also say that when I applied to college, everyone applied undecided, like as a strategy. Like, let's apply undecided. That way they can't utilize my major as a reason to deny me. I mean, they could if the whole population applies undecided. So you can't really use that as a strategy unless, of course, A, you truly are in fact undecided, and so then you don't want to declare a major, or B, you're thinking between a couple different things, and so maybe you go with the one that after asking some questions at that college visit, you find out maybe the stats are a little bit higher to get into that particular, or a little lower rather, than to get into that particular college than another one. So if you're thinking between, I don't know, let's say marketing, which falls under the business major, and econ, which falls under the College of Liberal Studies, maybe you end up going with econ because you're interested in both, and you end up finding out that that particular school is maybe a little less competitive than the School of Business, for example. So it requires a little bit of research, usually on the student's part, and those are great questions to ask when you're doing a visit, or as a follow-up after you've done a visit, where you email a rep and ask those types of questions.
And just to add to that too, depending on the school, like Ms. Cahill and Ms. Wu said, it really depends on the student and the school, because some schools, you're allowed to choose multiple choice colleges and or majors. So if you're not admissible to your top choice, they will then consider you for your second choice. So again, it really does kind of depend on the student and the school in terms of should you declare your major and how competitive it is. Okay, do we have any? Okay, we've got some more down here. Okay. Tricky.
I didn't see the hand.
We need a mic on
Okay.
the screen.
Can you give us a little bit more details if you are waitlisted on one college And is there any situation where you actually apply twice to the same college, like early admission and the regular one?
Okay, so in terms of decisions, if a student is waitlisted, that typically means, the student had statistics that made them competitive, but a school, really didn't have room to admit those students, so they will add them to a wait list. That's a process, that they can definitely talk to us about. Typically, the schools will send out information with their decisions that tell you the next steps. So if you're waitlisted, you may need to send a card in to indicate that you want to stay on the wait list, and schools will also tell you how they utilize the wait list in terms of, one thing I'm sure some people have heard of is, do they rank a wait list or things like that. So a lot of schools will indicate whether they are looking, for interest or majors that a student is interested in when they start pulling off of a wait list. And they'll also talk about, let you know how many times they may have gone to the wait list, but that does depend on each year, because it will depend on final enrollment in terms of, do they have spots that they need to fill in that class? If they have all the students that they sent acceptances to, fill the spots that they have open, then they will not go to the wait list. But if they do have spots open and your son or daughter has indicated that they want to stay on that wait list, then the schools would reach out to them, and they usually will give them somewhere between like a week or, even a few days to then turn around and let them know if they want to attend that school. And I know you had a second part to your question.
You apply to the same school twice.
Okay, yeah. If you want.
Okay, so I'll answer that part, and then I have something to add to Ms. Wu's answer. So your other question was, is there a reason or a time where you would apply to a school basically 2 times within a given year, in an early process and in a regular process? No, not the way you phrase it. But what you can see happen is that a student applies during the early process and the school defers them, which means that they're considered twice because they're considered during the early action or the early decision process, and the school's like, we're not totally positive about you yet, but we're not really ready to let you go either. Like, we want to kind of see what our regular decision applicant pool looks like and make a better decision later on. Or we want to see what your first semester grades look like. Or maybe we want to even suggest to you that you consider submitting testing, for example, if we're having trouble making up our minds about you. So there could be a lot of reasons why a school might defer a student to regular decision. So you kind of are getting the 2 bites at the apple in the sense that you're considered in the early process and then you're deferred to the regular process and reconsidered, but you're not actually applying 2 times in that year. The only time that you're going to see students that are reapplying to a college is they're reapplying as a transfer student, for example. But you're not going to see a student be applying twice to one particular school in a given year. So your question was about wait lists, but I do want to address the idea that typically when we see students applying in an early decision or early action process, we hear a lot about deferrals in the beginning. That's a lot of what you see in mid to late December, is students hearing back from a school and that school saying, we're not ready to make a decision about you. And then the question is like, oh my God, now what do I do? Do I write them? Do I call someone? Do I phone a friend and have a new letter of recommendation sent? The answer to those questions is, it depends. So it depends on what the school has told you. If they say don't call us, we'll call you, please don't provide any additional data, please follow the directions. It's I think that college admissions might be 80% following the directions and 20% the rest of the application process. So I would really recommend that students follow the directions that they are provided. If they say you are, able to submit something through this form, please give us updates here, then give us updates here. Do not send other things that they're not asking for. Probably the worst thing that a student can do is find an alumni they don't even really know that knows their parent that then writes them a letter of recommendation when they don't really know them. So please don't do that. But what I would say is that deferral process brings about that sense of panic, right? So then your kids want to figure out, what do we do now? The answer to that question is, come see us. Because we've seen this for years, we know what to tell the students to do, we can help them follow those directions. And then for the waitlist process, again, as Ms. Wu said, that is, we like you, we just might not have enough room for you. And whether they go to their wait list, as she mentioned, has to do with their yield. Are they actually getting back the percentage they assumed they were going to get back when they put out all those acceptances. And if not, they're going to go to their wait list. So a lot of that is, it's going to depend on the applicant pool that particular year. They could have gone to their wait list the last 5 years, and then all of a sudden their team wins the championship, and now it's like, forget it, nobody's getting off their wait list because everybody's saying yes. It just depends on that particular application year. But we can help students to figure out, do you send something? What do you send? And so I would really encourage your student, if they're stressed about a deferral or a wait list, to come and see their counselor.
You just touched upon one thing that I had a question on. Some of the schools say that they'll accept additional letters of recommendation separate from the teachers and the counselor. Is that something you recommend they do, that they don't? And if they are submitting, how are those submitted if they're outside of the school?
Okay, so that process will differ depending on the school. Hopefully you're sensing a theme. Everything depends on the school and following the directions that they've given you. So if they've indicated that they will accept additional recommendations, you know, a student can certainly send 1, maybe 2 additional recommendations. You don't want to, you know, go and send 7 additional recommendations from like an alumni that you don't really know. So one of the key things is, when you are thinking about submitting additional recommendations, you know, what purpose are you asking that other person to write that letter for? Are they going to be adding something additional that your teachers or your counselor isn't already going to kind of indicate through their letter about your son or daughter? So if there is a reason and something that they feel that that other person will really be able to add about them, then they can go ahead, you know, and submit that extra letter. In terms of how that letter is submitted, like I said, it will depend on the school, but typically if a school is utilizing Common Application, there is an area within Common App where you can add other recommenders, and those would be those additional letters. And it's pretty easy in the recommender section. You know, you would just follow the directions there, but if they have any questions on how to do that, they can certainly let us know. I think the biggest thing that we've seen in the past with that is just to make sure that that other recommender knows that they're going to be getting an electronic communication to fill out a letter of recommendation, because oftentimes that went to spam and, you know, the person never got that information. And then for other schools, you know, if they're not utilizing Common App, they may have directions on their website with where to send it if they want it physically mailed to their admissions office, or if they have a portal that you'll be uploading that extra letter into.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I would echo that sentiment of like, why are you sending it? I think that students often feel like more is better, and, you know, if 8 people say I'm amazing, then I must be amazing. I think what they don't think about is that it's almost like you want to question how amazing somebody is if they need to send 8 letters of recommendation, right? It's like, are they looking to cover up something, and that's why they're sending all of these letters? So I think you've got to be careful with what messaging you send by sending too much information. So I think Ms. Wu had a great point of like, what's the purpose of that letter, and do you think that whatever is going to be covered by that person, that theme would actually be covered in other areas? Even if it's like a coach and you're like, but I'm such a great teammate. But maybe you're such a great teammate like in a classroom setting, or your counselor has seen that because they've seen you in group settings, or you're a peer leader, or so there's other ways maybe to get at that information without sending that additional communication.
Okay, thank you.
For the early decision, a lot of times they're November 1st deadlines, but I've seen schools also say November 1st is when you have to submit. November 4th, all the information needs to be received. And I thought you said that the transcripts could take 4 to 5 weeks. And if you apply on, let's say, October 31st, and it takes 5 weeks to get the transcripts, you're already into December, and how does that work?
Yeah, so just to clarify, transcripts don't take 4 to 5 weeks. Transcripts are sent electronically. They actually, like if I were to send a student's transcript on October 31st, theoretically it's received on October 31st. So they don't take 4 to 5 weeks to be requested and received. What I did say is we sometimes work up to the student's deadline. So in other words, like a student may be ready and they might have submitted their application on October 1st, but I might be working on 50 kids that are all applying by November 1st, so I don't necessarily send the transcript and the other materials on that date. what we think takes about 4 to 5 weeks, and it's probably a little bit less than that, but I hate to say that because then someone will quote me and be like, it should have been there by now. But SAT scores and ACT scores can take some time, because if you request them, for example, on a Friday, well, maybe that was the Friday that they send out SAT or ACT scores and the school collates them and puts them into your account. And then they only do that every second Friday or every third Friday. And so now what's happened is you now are actually waiting, not because the school doesn't have them, they're sitting somewhere, but because they haven't reflected that they have them. So that's why we tell students to give it about 4 to 5 weeks with standardized testing scores, because they are sent and then the schools usually upload every so often because they just get so much data that it's easier for them to wait until they have enough of it to start putting it into individual files. But no, transcripts don't take 4 to 5 weeks. So when the student meets with their counselor, we release their ability to request transcripts, assuming that they have followed steps 1 through 6 and they paid their transcript fee and things are matched and everything's like good to go. And then we release their ability to request transcripts. From the day that they request the transcript, if I've already written the letter and all my materials are uploaded, theoretically their transcript might go out the same day, but it also might go out a couple weeks later if I'm working on a bunch of other applicants before I get to that student.
And just to add to your question about, you can see a November 1 deadline, and that's really the application needs to be in. And then if you see a November 4th deadline for like supporting materials, that really can mean like your teacher letter can get there a few days later, or your counselor letter, or those types of things. But really the application needs to be there, and sometimes they have a different deadline for supporting materials. Not all schools, again, it depends on the school, but that's why you're seeing 2 different deadlines. Okay, I saw another hand. Okay, I guess I'll take that question. So that's a good question. Again, as we said previously, Ridge High School transcript does not include standardized testing. So if you are sending from the testing agency because your school requires that, you have to send it from the ACT.org website or College Board for SAT. Just also remember that some schools will allow you to self-report your test scores. So again, that means that you would just self-report it and you don't have to officially send it from the testing agency until you decide to enroll in that school. So again, when you're looking at your college list, I think what's helpful is to kind of figure out, do they want an official transcript or do they want you to self-report your transcript? Second thing, are they test optional? Third thing, do they want official test scores or do they want you to self-report your test scores? Like, those are really important things that logistically will help you kind of navigate the next steps of the process, like kind of having an idea of what those schools want regarding those pieces.
Yeah, I would also mention that the places that you find that information is really the school's website. We have a lot of students that are asking us like numerous questions about how the process works, because I think they're on the Common App only. Like, they're really not focused on the school's website, so they're not following like the step-by-step, here's what you have to do process on the school's website. The websites sometimes can be a little hard to navigate, but once you get to that like application procedure or requirements page, it should show you, here are the components of a complete application. So for example, something like an SRAR that we mentioned during the presentation, which is a self-report academic record, that requires students to take a copy of their transcript and type in all of the courses that they've taken each year, the grade that they've received in that course, and also the credits that they've received in those courses. Not only is it super important that they know whether they have to complete one of those, but it's really important that if they have a question when they're filling out the SRAR, a lot of the colleges have tutorials on their website that show students, like, here's how we want you to complete the SRAR. They are also welcome to ask us questions. We have students that think that we have standard classes, for example. We don't have any standard level classes. We only have college prep level classes, honors classes, and AP classes. So no student should ever be filling out an SRAR and indicating that we have a standard level course. So if they have questions, what I would say is, like, don't just default to something that you think might be true because you don't know. Go ahead and ask, and then we can clarify. But I would say use the school's website as a resource, and then also use the materials we've given as a resource. And if there are still questions, definitely reach out to your counselor. And I would really put the onus on your child. You are about to send them off into a big universe of people, and you're not going to be able to help them with some of these things once they get there. So it's super important that they are navigating a lot of this process by themselves. We don't expect them to flail around having no idea what they're doing. we expect that they figure out who their resources are, right, and go to the people that they need to go to ask those questions. It is super important that you don't take it upon yourself to be like, I know this is hard, let me just do this for you. Try not to do that, because they've got to be able to do this on their own.
I have another question on deadlines. Does the school also keep track of deadlines that are very specific to a college within the university? Because sometimes the deadline for the specific program tends to be earlier than the deadline for the university. So do you keep track of that, or does the student need to provide you with that deadline?
So we don't necessarily keep track of that, but sometimes, because we are working with the students, we may be aware of certain programs that students should apply earlier to. But in Senior Packet Part B, there is a college list, and we have on there a column for students to indicate what deadline they are applying to that school by, so that, we know what their application deadline is. And that may be different than what's posted like in Naviance, for example.
Yeah, I think that goes back to that research aspect, right? And having them make sure that they know whether they're using the deadline that is appropriate for them. I do go through my students list, and I think most of us do when we have our senior meeting, because hearkening back to a question we got before, is there a reason to sometimes apply early action? If I know a school typically takes the majority of their candidate pool from their early action deadline, I'm going to say to a student, you have a regular decision deadline down for this particular school. I wouldn't miss that early action deadline. Or you have the regular decision deadline, but there's actually a deadline for priority scholarship consideration. Are you sure you don't want to apply by 12/1 instead of January 15th, for example? So, we can give them some guidance on that. I would tell you, there's almost 4,000 schools in this country, so the likelihood that I'm going to be able to know the deadline for every single school and every single I wish I could make millions if I did, but unfortunately, we can't know that. So I would say it's really important that students do that research, and then we can try to help them, if they're struggling with that.
Hi. Where a school is offering its own application and also accepting the common application, is there any advantage to using their application over the common to display extra interest, or?
Does your kid like to type?
Yeah.
I'd say no.
Repetitive data.
Yeah, it's just a lot of repetitive data entry.
If a school, if a school is utilizing Common App or their own application, their indication that they're allowing students to use Common App means they're really not going to judge, one way or the other. So if you're using Common App, like Ms. Cahill was saying with typing, that saves you a lot of data entry, because Common Application is going to be your general information with, where you live, who your parents are, what classes you've taken, and that information goes to each of the schools that you're applying to that utilize Common App.
I would say the only reason I could think of that a student might do that is they get a free application from a school, right? The school contacts them and says, you can apply for free through our application. I guess I could see why they might do that. There are times when they say, and we'll waive the essay, and you don't have to send any supporting documents. That's great if you're way above their stats, right? That makes sense. If you're not, I probably wouldn't encourage a student to utilize that type of process either. So I would say if a student has one of those, they should probably just talk to their counselor to make sure that that's a good plan.
I just had a question about, if you guys have any insights on the COVID backlog and how the schools were backed up. Is that done? Is that cleared out? Or, because you hear there was 50,000 applicants last year to a school that received 30,000 normally.
Yeah, I think your question could be answered in two different ways. So do you mean, since COVID, is that particular school still experiencing a huge influx in applications? I would say where we've seen that quite a bit is in large public schools, and maybe that is more a reflection of the economy since COVID than it even is about that particular school, for example. I would also say that there is something to be said for the idea that COVID has messed with some yields. Some schools got less kids than they thought they were going to get. Other schools got more kids than they thought they were going to get. There was a period of time where the UC system in California was so overpacked with students that they couldn't graduate them in 4 years. So there was a good reason to maybe reconsider your plan to apply to a UC system school, because if you're trying to graduate in 4 years and that becomes very difficult, maybe that's not something that you want to do. So I would say the answer to your question is kind of nuanced, because I think that there are certain schools that are still being hit pretty hard with applications. I also think that that could be a result of the test optional plan. So, schools are getting, and there's a lot of reasons why a school might want to remain test optional. They're getting applicants from areas they may not have gotten applicants from before. So what we know about standardized testing is that race, ethnicity, and money play a role in whether or not a student has a high standardized test score. And so now that testing is optional, they may be seeing applicants from high schools and areas that they didn't necessarily have qualified applicants from before, because if they were requiring testing and the kids didn't have high enough testing, they might have self-selected not to apply to that school. Now that the school is test optional, maybe now they're getting applicants from places that they actually would like to accept people from, and the GPAs are high enough to, sustain an acceptance. Yes, many schools went. Actually, the only schools that didn't go test optional because of COVID were Florida State schools. Yeah, so, and I would say that since then, no, I mean, fairtest.org has existed for a very long time, and schools have been test optional long before COVID. So that was a list of schools that were always test optional. There are many, many more right now because either of the access to testing a few years ago, or the gaps that they have seen in education that result sometimes in lower testing scores. So for example, things like mathematics, where, when we said goodbye to kids on March 13th and said, see you in 3 weeks, and it was like, or not. So, obviously that played a role in the consistency of their education. Some of them fared just fine, and other people struggled a bit more. So they're being cognizant of that by saying that maybe standardized testing isn't our best gauge at the moment.
Okay, just in the interest of time, we just have time for a few more questions. So,
I have 2 questions. It's about the Navion. Now, first question, the Navion collected about 10 years data. Now, for the last few years, things been changed dramatically. So how do you feel the Navion really, help students to make a family to make decisions? How accurate that be? That's the first question. Now, the second question is that for some schools, it seems to be, I would say, don't accept a lot of students from RHS. Is that safe to conclude that school or regional school actually just a particular don't have put in a way, don't have relationship with the RHS, that strong relationship with RHS?
Okay. All right, so I'm going to answer the first part in terms of Naviance. I think Naviance, if you haven't logged into it, your son and daughters, they all have access to this program. So in it, we do house data about Ridge High School students who applied to schools and their GPAs and test scores on ACT, SAT. So each school has a scatogram where they can kind of see a picture of that range. If your kids haven't shown it to you, it's a great tool to kind of look at. Now, it's a great gauge in terms of getting an idea of where you fit in that school's academic profile. But as you mentioned, it does have a lot of data in there, and we can't really, tease out certain things like, did a student apply early decision, early action, or regular, right on that graph, or what major they applied to. And then you can change the chart to show the SAT or the ACT score, but you kind of have to keep in mind that a student may have submitted an application and been accepted based on their GPA and maybe the ACT, but they also took the SAT, so their data point might be on the SAT graph as well. So there's a lot of information on there, and I think it's definitely helpful as a gauge to understand where they fit in that academic profile of the school, but to kind of keep in mind that it's not, something that is giving you an answer. Like if you are within all the squares, that are green, meaning the student was accepted, that you're definitely, going to be accepted, because it does depend on the year and the applicant pool that a school is getting that year.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Ms. Wu just said. I would say it's better to show you whether it's a reach than it is to show you. Target is sometimes harder because, as Ms. Wu was saying, you don't necessarily know exactly what deadline they were using. We do, actually, so we can actually tease out some of that information for students. We can't give them, exact data points, but we can say, it's interesting because the kids that are in your general vicinity, they were applying early decision if they were accepted. So we can kind of give them a little bit more data than what they can see specifically from that graph. But I would also say we don't know in the last couple of years if that student went test optional, for example. So you can see that green data point and you don't necessarily know whether the student provided their standardized test scores when you're looking at whether or not they were accepted. So I would say that's thankfully why we're here, right? Like, because if we could just use computers for our entire job, then I could be like, hey, good night, like you wouldn't need me for anything. So luckily, that is the reason why we're here to help them, is to kind of look at that particular school, know what we know about the trends in the last couple of years, and try to help them understand their data point on that particular graph as much as we possibly can. The second part of your question had to do with relationships. Do we think that the reason that students from Ridge are not being accepted to certain schools has to do with like relationships or lack thereof with particular places? I mean, maybe this is my personal opinion and my colleagues can decide whether or not they agree with me, but I think that it's mostly that they are looking for a range of different types of people. And we provide applicants that are very similar to other schools within the state of New Jersey. So just because they only took one student or two students from Ridge doesn't mean they didn't take a couple from Chatham and a couple from Milburn and a couple from Summit. And we have similar courses and we have similar transcripts and similar students who are applying with similar stats. So it's just hard to know whether that is because a bunch of students who looked very, very similar on paper. And listen, we know that there are applicants that when you meet them, you're like, oh, you're great. Like, why didn't that school take you? Well, because not every school does an interview process, and so they have to make decisions based on what they can see in front of them. And sometimes statistically, they only took a certain number of applicants from a certain type of school. And we only know, in Naviance, all you're seeing is data from Ridge High School. So as Ms. Wu said, it's helpful, but it's not the whole picture.
I'm going to kind of just close out the last question, which was an email question regarding senior meetings. And I'm going to take this question because I'm going to close out the night. So when are senior meetings happening was the question that we got through email. And so again, like we said previously, the checklist is an indication to the counselor that the student is ready for their senior meeting. And I can tell you, I can speak for my colleagues, that senior meetings are underway. We have started them. We're meeting individually with our seniors, going over their lists, going over their plans, regardless of what your student's plan is, whether they are applying to a 4-year school, a 2-year school, military, whatever they choose, they will all have a senior meeting. We are here to help. So if you have a student who's confused, not really sure, has questions, has done the checklist, wants to talk about it, we are going to meet with them individually and go over everything. If they have questions after that, we are here. This is our job. They are never bothering us. Don't hesitate to reach out with questions. We have given you a lot of information tonight, but you might still be sitting here with still some questions. I would encourage you to go home and review this presentation, which will be posted. I also encourage you to visit the post-secondary planning site. A lot of the questions that you may have or your student might have will be answered there. And then talk to your student. Talk to them. Ask them, did you turn in your packet, part A, part B? Where are you with the checklist? When is your senior meeting? So please encourage them to communicate. We want to help. We're excited to help your student and your family through this process. We know it's a lot, but please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions. We hope that you found this presentation helpful. Again, reach out to your school counselor, your individual counselor with any questions, and encourage your students to stop in and see us. It was a great night to have this live presentation. We hope you found it helpful, and have a great night.